All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with the patrons, please check out patreon.com/DarwinGross. That's DarwinGrosse. Now enjoy the podcast. Okay, today I get a chance to meet somebody new, but someone whose work I'm pretty excited to hear more about. His name is Nick Demopoulos. He reached out to me as kind of a fan of the podcast, but also somebody who's got some release work in play and is doing some instrument design that is pretty jaw-dropping. So with no further ado, let's talk to Nick. Hey, Nick, how's it going?
Hey, Darwin, how you doing?
I'm all right. Thanks a lot for taking the time to have this chat. I really do appreciate it, man.
Oh, absolutely.
So why don't we start off by having you talk a little bit about your work? I know from just your site and from looking at some of your social media stuff, you've got some releases out, but a lot of that is really based off of a focus on instrument building, right?
Yes, that's correct. I have been designing MIDI controllers that I play music with, and some of them actually are instruments now where they're not really MIDI controllers. They actually emit sound. And yeah, I've been writing music and releasing music with those instruments.
Right. Now, the one that is on a lot of your media, and in fact, there's a lot of kind of connections to like email addresses you use and stuff, is something called a Smomid. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so that instrument, the name is an acronym for String Modeling MIDI Device. It's a way for a guitar player to interface with music software. So it's like a MIDI controller that's shaped like a guitar. It's not necessarily played like a guitar, but a guitar player could pick it up and probably play music with it, instantly.
Sure. No, I think I will right off the bat say if you're listening to this and you're near a web browser, jump over to smomid.com. That's SMOMID.com. And the big picture at the top will give you a sense of what we're talking about, which is a large, like strapped-on type instrument, but one that, and it has a neck, but it also has a lot of hand controls. The neck, that's not strings on there, right? Is that some sort of like button pad or something like that?
It's those are called membrane potentiometers.
Oh,
so
okay.
They're big, long resistors that are location sensitive.
Oh, very interesting. And so like each, if I put a quote marks around it, each string then, is that one resistor or is it a bunch of them stretched? No, I guess it would have to be one, right?
Yeah, each one is one resistor. So it's basically like a potentiometer that's just like stretched out.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. Interesting. How do you interface that to... You said that you kind of use it as a bridge to be able to work with MIDI devices and I assume DAWs and stuff like that. How do you make that connection? So
all those sensors are plugged into either Arduino or a Teensy.
Okay.
And they're changing the resistance from the sensors into MIDI data, and the MIDI data is coming as control change data. And it's going into either Max or Pure Data. And then all the mapping and all the sound is coming out of Max and Pure Data.
Ah, I see. Okay. Now, how many different controls and how many different like lanes of data are coming out of that thing?
That's a good question. So I guess, so on the guitar controller, there's, I have two Teensies inside of that. And there's about like 12 control change. There's about 24 control change things between those two Teensies coming out on two MIDI channels. And then there's MIDI coming back from the computer or from Max or something or Pure Data to the LEDs on the instrument. So there's like 12 LEDs on there too. And then there's also digital inputs, which are like buttons. So there's like 16 buttons too.
Okay. And now, one of the things is, in looking at it, it doesn't look... So I like using the phrase like opinionated, as in like one that makes a lot of decisions for you, right? This does not look like a particularly opinionated controller, because it looks like if you wanted to, you could take any of these controls and define it to run kind of anything that you want. Now, some of the things like the string-like potentiometers probably are going to be obvious for pitch-like control, because that's what a guitarist is going to be used to doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you have tons of like knobs and, like you said, buttons available. What do you have, like, sort of an imagined vision of like what those should be mapped to, or do you leave it kind of open for, you know, on kind of like a performance by performance basis?
I kind of try and vary it. I do try and think of, you know, interesting ways to use those strings. So I do use them like a fretted guitar where it's like mapped out pitches.
Mm-hmm.
I also use it like a fretless guitar. So it's, or like a cello or like a violin.
Oh,
so
sure.
you're just playing it without the frets. And then I have two tunings that I use. One is like standard tuning, 12 notes to the octave, and one is 36 notes to the octave. And then I have like a arpeggiator mode for all those different things. So, you know, I could, like if I play a note, it will like arpeggiate different patterns
Mm-hmm.
based on that. And then I also use it to play percussion samples. So it's kind of like, you know, on a string, as you go higher, the frequency gets higher. So I kind of took that concept, and as I go higher, the rhythms get faster.
Oh, okay.
And it's kind of mapped to like, you know, 16th notes, 32nd notes, that kind of, you know, triplets and things like that. And then I also use it I'll take an audio file and I'll map it to the length of a string, and I could like a long sample, and I can just kind of like touch it and trigger the sample from that point, you know?
Sure. Yeah. So literally it's like, you're like touching the playhead of the sample almost.
Exactly. Yes.
That's really neat. Now, to what extent does this give you the ability to kind of run your system hands off? I mean, it's as a guitar player myself, one of the real frustrations in using guitar on stage with like a DAW or something. I mean, I literally don't, because I find myself frustrated because I want to control a bunch of things and I just find it very difficult. So I end up just like falling back to kind of stock guitaristic pedal boards and loopers and live with the rather limited result that I can get out of that. Now, obviously this gives you the ability to maybe do a lot more control. Do you feel like you can mostly work hands off of the computer with this?
Yeah, definitely. Because actually, I feel the exact same way as you. I don't really want to look at a computer when I'm playing music.
Right.
So I have these other controllers that I made I call them Pyramidis, and they're kind of inspired. They're triangular. They're not like a pyramid, but they're like triangular in shape, and they have a lot of LEDs on them. And I use those to kind of select sounds and trigger effects and things like that.
Okay.
And they have, because of the LEDs, they have a lot of visual feedback. So I can press a button, mm-hmm. a light will turn on, and I know that's on. And then I have like a, you know, tap tempo delay and things like that, where the lights are blinking. So I know what's happening. So I don't have to look at, you know, my computer. And I have another one, another Pyramidi that I use that's kind of like a really fancy looper. So I use that mostly for looping. So yeah, I really don't have to look at the computer when I'm playing.
Right. And then on the computer end, are you just running Max or PD, or is that also kind of feeding into a DAW like Live or Logic or something like that?
No, it's just purely Max.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I used to do, actually before Max for Live came out, I was using Live, Max into Live, but then I just kind of abandoned it and just use Max mostly.
Sure. Fewer moving parts, right?
Yeah.
Well, this is pretty amazing, because this Pyramidi thing, I noticed that on your website as well. I was curious about that. It seems like you've got your hands pretty full as an instrument builder and controller builder, but also you have some of your release work on the site. And frankly, I was actually pretty surprised, because I was expecting, a lot of times with like experimental instruments like this, people tend to move into kind of like ambient territory because, first of all, it's maybe not as aggressive in terms of like pitch tracking requirements or some of that kind of stuff. But secondly, because especially with things that have kind of arbitrary tuning options, it's a little easier to be open with your tuning choices or something like that. But you pretty much are willing to just like dive into almost any kind of style and take it on, and I'm kind of curious because so it's clear that you have some really significant musical chops, but you also have the kind of chops that kind of builder chops that allow you to make an instrument that is clearly a complex build, and also the software interaction chops to be able to make Max and PD pieces that are fulfilling all of your software needs. Where do you come from where all of these things are somewhere in your comfort level? It sounds like an amazing combination of skills.
Well, I worked, I guess my background is as a guitar player. So I started as a guitar player, and I was, using lots of pedals and things like that, loopers and devices. And then I was using Max, and I kind of wanted to, but I was using it with like a keyboard type MIDI controller. Okay. So my background is in jazz guitar, and I guess I'm bringing that to electronic music. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
it does. But it's also pretty much a non sequitur. I don't know that many jazz, serious jazz players that are comfortable approaching and attacking electronic music. Those seem to be like almost polar opposite ends of the world, right?
I think you're right about that. I think I love jazz, and I love the jazz tradition and the music and bebop and all that, but it's very rooted in like history, right, and tradition. And electronic music is like so focused on the future and like what hasn't happened and like the possibilities. So that's why I kind of like, playing electronic music.
Right on. So what in your background got you into jazz? It sounds like that was where you really kicked things off. Did you kind of grow up studying it, or was it something you picked up in college or something like that? Where did the jazz thing come from for you? Okay,
so as a teenager, I grew up in LA, and as a teenager, I was like, typical teenager into like metal. So I was into heavy metal, into like Yngwie Malmsteen, and just like shredding guitar. And then from there, I got into like Al Di Meola, and then from that, I got into Al Di Meola's work with Chick Corea, Return to Forever.
Oh yeah.
And then from there, I was like, oh, who's this Chick Corea person? Then I studied him, and I saw he played with Miles Davis. And then I checked out Miles Davis, like electric projects. And then from there, I was like, what did this Miles Davis person do? So then I saw he played with Charlie Parker. And then I got hooked on, Charlie Parker. And by high school, that was like what I was super into.
That's really interesting. Now, to what extent did you pursue that? Because it has some parallels with me, and especially the connection to Al Di Meola. That was a person that was a real touchstone for me as a guitarist, going from my interest in highly, in technical and hyper capable guitar playing, into kind of the world of jazz players. It was a really great starting point. But there was also this sense that tracking jazz was also like tracking something that was purposefully difficult to learn, and in a way represented a challenge that I really loved. Is that something that was for you, or was it very natural for you?
I think I was attracted to the kind of mental exercises of jazz as well. Right. Like it is kind of like getting from point A to point B by doing all these like harmonic and melodic manipulations and patterns and stuff. I think that I was really attracted to that. I think that kind of mindset comes into place in like maybe in chess and maybe in mathematics. It's something like you're doing like an operation to get from point A to point B.
Right.
And I was really into math and into chess too at different points in my life.
Yeah, sure. Well, and obviously then also electronics, since it seems, from looking at this device and then hearing you talk about like interfaces into Teensies and Arduinos, you have no fear of taking on electronics either. When did that come into play for you?
So I guess the first MIDI controller I made, well, so I had a band called Exegesis, and there was three of us, guitar, bass, and drums. I was using Macs on stage and using all these like live looping devices and pedals, playing guitar and keyboard. And the bass player was doing the same thing, doing live looping and triggering like, all this stuff. But the drummer was playing just acoustic drums. Mm-hmm. So that always kind of bothered me. So I wanted to make a drum controller for our drummer.
Okay.
So I researched it a little bit, and I saw that there was a class, how to make a MIDI controller, at the LEMURplex in Brooklyn.
Oh, wow.
And the LEMURplex is run by Eric Singer.
Right.
And so I took this class. There was a guy named Leif Krenkel who was teaching the class, and he's really intelligent. I mean, he could speak on how to make MIDI controllers forever. He knows everything about it, and he just had a lot of confidence that he could just teach us how to do this in a couple hours. I was kind of amazed with that approach, but he figured we could do it, and so I figured I could do it if he had that confidence. And we used a thing called a MIDI-tron that Eric Singer made, and as soon as I saw the membrane potentiometer in that class, which is like the string type thing I use, I kind of forgot about the drum controller, and I was like, oh, that looks like a string.
Drummer's on his own now.
Yeah. So I was like, I could make a guitar controller with this.
That's amazing. Wow. And how many iterations did it take for you to get your first sort of like playable instrument?
So the first one I made was really ambitious. I got a wireless MIDI-tron, and I made it. It was wireless. I made it out of plexiglass, and it actually worked for like 2 weeks, and then it burned out because I think the resistors I had in it weren't large enough, so they burned the sensors out. And then I tried another one, and that didn't work. And then I was like, okay, I'll try one more time. So I made a third one, and that one actually worked. And it only had like 4 strings in it. Mm-hmm. And as soon as I made that, I was like, okay, now I want to make like a bigger one, like a one with 6 strings. So that took me a while of research. So the first one I made was in 2010.
Okay.
And then after doing some research and figuring out, I actually emailed Eric. I was like, is there something I could do that has more inputs? And he's like, you should look into getting an Arduino. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really know, how to program an Arduino or anything. So he said, why don't you get in touch with the NYC resistor, which is like a kind of makerspace in Gowanus, Brooklyn. Okay,
right.
So I reached out to their mailing list, and through that I met this guy named Ranjit Bhatnagar. I don't know if you know him, but he has made like a bazillion instruments. Like for a couple of years, like in February, he would make an instrument every single day. He's like a really high level programmer. So I connected with him, and he wrote some Arduino code that basically just takes analog input or digital input and outputs control change data on an Arduino.
Right.
So I took that and I made actually at that point in Brooklyn, there was a lot of things going on. So I had a friend who was a woodworker, and there was this huge facility called Third Ward where he had a studio. So I went there, and with him, I kind of collaborated with him, and he made the wood body. Okay. And then I took those two things and put everything together, and I assembled it and did all the electronics, it's a lot of work, but it's not that complicated. It's just like soldering a sensor to a resistor to into the Arduino. And I had my first like 6-string version of the Smomid.
And that was what year?
That was in 2012.
Okay.
And then, as soon as I had that done, I was like, okay, I need more. So, so then I made 2 Pyramidis, which are like the first versions of those were like these wooden triangular boxes with LEDs on them. And those are also Arduino based. And then I started getting into working with these LED displays. which are if you see on my most recent Pyramidis, they're in there. They're like these matrices of LED squares or 7-segment delays.
Okay.
So I figured out how to use those, and so by this point I was kind of learning Arduino coding by myself. So I was doing all the Arduino coding, and so I put those into my instruments, and also I wanted to be able to make instruments like faster and be able to repeat them. So I started studying 3D modeling.
Okay, right.
So my latest instruments are modeled in Rhino, and they're just like cut out of wood or Corian, or those are the two materials I use.
Sure, that's interesting. So are these things that then you make either custom or commercially for sale?
So what started happening is I just started making them so that I could play music with them.
Right, yeah.
But I would show up to places and people would say, "Oh, can I buy one?" And I say, I don't have anything for sale. But it kept happening that I finally started thinking, I should make something I could sell.
Right.
So for the last couple of years, I've been really pursuing how to sell something. So my concept for that is having it, instead of being a MIDI controller where you need a computer to play it, just having it be a freestanding device.
Okay.
I started using Raspberry Pi running Pure Data,
mm-hmm.
and I'm working on something now that will be able. The Raspberry Pi will be embedded in the instrument, and you just have like an audio output. You just turn it on and plug it into an amp or something, and just start playing.
Oh, right. Interesting. But that would be the Smomid and not the Pyramidi, right?
Well,
or both, or either.
Well, what I did a couple years ago, I made like a kind of a table version of an instrument.
Okay.
And you play it kind of like a lap steel guitar.
Okay.
So there's strings on it, but you play it like sitting down.
All right.
And I'm going to make a Pyramidi with those in it. So but it'll be a small version. So I think it'll be like something you could put in a case and fly around in an airplane with. And it'll be small, and you could still, play melodies on it.
Right. Well, that makes a lot of sense, because one of the things I was wondering is, the Smomid that you use it in your own performance, right?
Yes.
How do you make it so that it is really functional on stage without being like a constant breakdown? I mean, my experience with building bespoke instruments that I take onto stage, I mean, there's actually two problems for me. First of all, making them so that they really are strong enough and robust enough to work on stage actually represents like almost as much work as getting them to work in the first place, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then secondly, I know what I did. And so then I start ending up like with these weird head games where I'm like, oh, this thing's going to fail. Oh, this thing's going to fail. And even if it doesn't fail, I work myself into a bit of lather worrying about it. Where if I'm using instruments that someone else built, I don't know what's going to fail. So I just play it, right?
Yeah.
How do you cope with making the instruments that actually represent your performance instruments?
Well, for one thing, I practice with them a lot. So like they do fail, and I try and figure out why, and I try and fix them. But the one thing I learned from making instruments is that you have to make them serviceable. So in other words, you should be able to take it apart and be able to get to any component in there and be able to change the wires, or change a resistor or something, because things do get loose, or wires will, like if two wires touch, like maybe the resistance value will change on a sensor. So you have to make them, like the latest guitar controller I made, it comes apart into 3 pieces, and I can have access to any of it. Whereas the first one I made, it's just like the stuff is like buried in there, and it's like really hard to
right
to get to,
Yeah.
So that's one thing. I've learned a lot. Actually, the latest guitar controller I made, I tried to save myself some time by using these, I forget what you call them, but they're like a bunch of jumper cables that are all stuck together, and they're kind of color coded. So it saved me a lot of time using those. But because a Teensy is like such a powerful microcontroller,
mm-hmm.
that the kind of gauge of wire you use actually affects the thing.
Yeah. But you're saying that this thing was putting out so much amperage, it was actually troublesome with those kind of small wires?
I had to change all those wires because they were they were getting, I guess, like electronic noise. Like the values were like bouncing around a little bit.
All right.
And I learned something else is that the Teensy is like a really powerful microcontroller, and it's like so fast that like when you take your finger off of a string, it actually measures the value of it going back to zero.
Oh,
that's how fast it is.
While it's going back. Oh, wow. Interesting.
So I had to do some programming in Max and stuff to limit that.
Sure.
And also like I had to add some capacitors to the just to like have a little bit of power down there so that it would, because it's like super sensitive
Sure.
instrument.
So one of the things that you talked about when you talked about kind of learning jazz is that you were drawn not only to sort of like the complexity and the chess game of it, but also that you recognized that there was a jazz tradition, and you seemed to kind of embrace that. And part of the tradition of jazz, or really kind of any music, is that instruments themselves have kind of a traditional way of being played, tradition of how you sit or stand with them, what's a good finish and all this kind of junk, right? There's a lot of tradition tied into instruments. Mm-hmm. But when you're making your own instrument, there's none of that. How do you, as you say, you practice a lot, but do you think of it as like an extended guitar, or do you think of it as its own thing? And if you think about it as its own thing, how are you developing its own tradition out of nothing?
I try and think of musical ideas. I don't really think of the instrument as much. I think of like musical ideas, and I try and make them happen somehow on the instrument. Like one time I had something where instead of an arpeggiator, I had like a 12-tone row, and I could trigger it from any note on the instrument, and then I had ways to play it, backwards, upside down, or upside down and backwards. And I messed with that for a while. I do the percussion stuff. I just try and think of like music. I don't think of like what I can play on an instrument. And even on guitar, I kind of like, because I practice guitar and play guitar, and I think of just like ideas. I try not to be limited by the instrument. And it's kind of impossible because there's certain things you can play on piano right. that you just can't play on guitar.
Yeah.
But you could find a way to do a lot of things,
but there's also, the thought process to me, whenever I'm doing something musically that is sort of theory oriented, I always kind of need to be working on a keyboard, because the way that a musical keyboard is laid out, it's sort of like, music theory, sitting right there in front of you, right? On the guitar, it's a little less, or it's a lot less of that. And so for me, the layout of the guitar is more one of convenience of being able to do certain kinds of physical motion or whatever, as opposed to being really theory oriented. What do you find with like the Smomid? What do you find is the thing that it draws you into? Is it like really good for like playing off of sound design? Is it really good for working at like with really fast activity, or is it oriented towards, is it more oriented towards harmonic development than melodic development? What do you find that this instrument draws you into doing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think so. Coming from the guitar, one thing that about it is like when you pluck a note, it immediately starts to decay. Whereas on this instrument, I could just hold a note like forever, and it will just play like an organ or something.
Right.
So that's one thing I really like about it. And you can shape the note with a joystick. So I can which is like mostly a filter, and have another joystick that's like a pitch bend. So I like being able to shape notes and have that sustain. I also like the fact that I can kind of control like the entire, the whole musical landscape of whatever I'm performing just from my instruments, triggering sections of a song, changing the beats, putting effects on the drums. So most of those like potentiometer knobs on my guitar controller are like, LFOs and ring modulators and things like that the drums go through. So I have all the effects for everything on one or two instruments.
So you're sort of not only playing the lead guitar-like instrument, but you're also kind of mixing the whole band simultaneously.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, I bet you need to take a nap after a gig. That sounds like a lot of work.
Well, the thing that happens is sometimes it's like people have told me like, why is there such drastic volume changes? And it's a mistake, but sometimes like the drums will just pop up or something,
right.
The bass will pop up. But yeah, it's actually, it's not as hard as, I don't know. It's not that complicated.
Okay. So the work that you're doing, it sounds like you play with a band. Are you still working a 3-piece band, or do you? Because again, that seems like then you have a lot of sonic land space to fill. It's one of the things with the trio that's always kind of amazing to me is sort of like the amount of space that everyone is sort of responsible for filling. Well,
once this project kind of got going, I incorporated this into the band. I was playing with Exegesis, but
right.
Once this got going, also those guys were getting really busy playing in all these other projects. So for us to either tour or to perform even locally was getting more difficult. So I started just playing solo with this instrument. And now I don't really play with a band now, but I do collaborate with people like as an instrumentalist. So I mostly perform solo.
Oh, that's really interesting. Wow. That again, then it just feels like it's putting a lot of pressure on yourself. Although again, I imagine too, by having an instrument where the layout and the functionality is under your control, it also means that you can make it as convenient as you need to in order to be able to pull off a solo set.
Yeah, and in a way, it's very liberating because I can. I don't know. It's like it's. I mean, it's a lot of fun. I don't know how to explain it, but it's kind of liberating playing solo. I do miss collaborating with people, and I still do that in other things. But and just from a logistic point of view, like if you get a gig, you don't have to check with these other people if they can do it. You could just say, "Yeah, I'll do it."
Sure, absolutely. Now, one of the things you mentioned earlier is that on this system, you have two different tuning standards. You have one that's like a 12-note per octave tuning system, and one that's, I think you said 36-note per octave.
Mm-hmm.
For you, what is the draw into like microtonalism? What is it something that you naturally heard, or is it something you started exploring with and fell in love with? What's the difficulty involved in making music that uses a 36-note per octave scale?
The way I got into that was, so in 2008, the band that I was playing with, Exegesis, we auditioned and got selected to be in this program that the State Department has that are like musical ambassadors. So we got sent to the Middle East to play, to be cultural ambassadors and play jazz and talk about American culture. And one of the things you do is you perform with local musicians. So I went to Bahrain and started playing with these oud players, and I was like, wow, this is really cool music. And then I went to Yemen and was playing with these people in Yemen, and like this guy was playing alto sax, doing quarter steps and stuff. Mm-hmm. And all these oud players, and I was like, I have to like check this out. So I bought an oud in Yemen, and I shipped it back to New York. And then when I got back to New York, I walked into this falafel place, and I saw a guy holding an oud. And I just said, hey, can you give me lessons?
I'm sorry, but that is like, that story just like took a left turn. I was in Yemen, I shipped an oud back, and then I was in a falafel place, and I was like, wait, what?
Well, this is really interesting. So I walk into this falafel place, and not far from my apartment, and I see this kind of grumpy looking old man. I said, can you give me some oud lessons? And he was like, yeah, sure. Not too excited about it. So I go to his apartment, and this guy is he's Najib Shaheen, and his brother is Simone Shaheen, who's like one of the most like preeminent virtuosic oud players that I've ever heard.
Wow.
So these guys come from like this tradition, like their dad played oud, like their whole family plays oud.
Right. They're serious about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I studied with him for a while, and we got into the quarter steps and like the microtonality of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I was really getting the hang of it. And then I started playing with Chico Hamilton, who's like a jazz drummer, like right around that same time.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he was really kind of demanding of what I would play. So I kind of realized I had to stop playing oud because I couldn't pursue it as fully as I wanted to, and not just like embarrass myself in front of my teacher. So
right.
I kind of put it down, and I just like, focused more back to guitar. But what happened was once I made these guitar MIDI controllers, I realized I could bring it back into my music, and it was like way easier to play than playing on an oud, which is like you have to really have command of the instrument, use your ear to play it,
mm-hmm.
in tune. It's really hard.
Right.
So, but on my MIDI controller, it's easy because I could just press a note and it's like, there it is, So I kind of wanted to also do something a little different. I have a friend who plays a MIDI controller, Leon Gruenbaum, and he has an instrument called the Samchillion.
Yes.
And I was watching him, and he plays some crazy stuff. And I was like, what is that? And he said,
I've seen him in action with that thing. It's like ridiculous.
Yeah. And he has a tuning that's 40 notes to the octave.
Uh-huh.
And it just was mind blowing to listen to him play that. So I wanted to get something a little like smaller resolution than 24 notes. So I did 36 notes, and I kind of I still think of it like tonally. So I still play like notes, right. But then I'll do like like I'll go a little bit flat or a little bit sharp.
Yeah, what's interesting about choosing 36 notes is that you have the 12 note per octave thing is still sitting there, but mm-hmm. you have like kind of two stepping points in between each semitone, which I can imagine even for doing like pattern based things, doing patterns that kind of just slide up or down, one of these increments, would be an interesting way of adding tension and doing tension and release kind of feelings, pretty naturally. Yeah,
it's great. And yeah, and with the arpeggiator, you can get some, amazing patterns. And I actually started like looking, like kind of researching, like scales. And I found this book. I can't remember the name of it, but it was like there's a book or a treatise from 1200 AD that's based on another treatise from 700 AD of like ancient Arabic and Greek scales.
Okay.
So I took that and I kind of adopted it a little bit to the scales that I have in my arpeggiator, and I play a lot of those. So that's kind of cool. Then I made some of my own patterns too. Sure.
Well, that sounds really interesting. One of the things though that then it makes me wonder is it seems like you're in a position where between experimenting with instrument building and experimenting with things like scale development and scale experiments and stuff like that, you could sort of be in experiment all the time mode. But, that's a trap that a lot of people get into when they become a builder, or like if they get into modular synths or they get into Max or PD. It's really tempting to just like all of a sudden become a full-time experimenter. And you forget that the original impetus was actually to make music, right?
Yeah.
How do you stay connected to the music making?
I know I definitely fall into that experimenting thing, and like there's been so much stuff that I've spent weeks of my life on that I just like threw away.
Yeah.
So one of the things I do is like once I have a scale or a tuning or arpeggiator or a drum sequencer, I can keep it and just use that for, hopefully for the rest of my life. So I made like I think a good drum sequencer that I use for like 80% of the stuff I do.
Okay.
A lot of the synths that I use, I've been using like, for a long time. So I kind of like am consistent with a lot of things I do, and I just kind of change, the harmonic or the melodic parts of the of the music I play.
Sure. Now, it sounds like you are, from the sound of it before, you're actually considering sort of music, moving everything to be sort of located on the hardware itself. You mentioned using a Raspberry Pi kind of as the driver for that. So unlike some of the things you could get off of like VST instruments or even things you might do on a standard laptop, do you find it at all limiting? And have you been exploring much like some of the other sound making systems like Chuck or Super Collider or any of that kind of stuff?
I looked into Super Collider, and I think at the time I did it, it was a little above me, because it's a text-based programming.
It's quite different if you're used to Max and PD, that's for sure.
Yeah. I started getting into processing, though, mostly for video animations. And so maybe I could come back to Super Collider. I do find it extremely limiting working on a Raspberry Pi. I mean, I'm always hitting the ceiling of processing power.
Yeah. And you mentioned visuals. Do you actually do visuals when you do your shows? And if so, are they in some way connected to these instruments as well?
Yeah, I started incorporating visuals like last year, and it's pretty awesome. I got to say, like I'm taking in either Max or PD. I'm sending out what is it? OSC messages, and they go into processing.
Uh-huh.
So I'm driving the animations from the same controls that are making the music. So it's fully ingrained together,
Yeah, well, what's interesting about that, and actually I had a discussion with William Fields a couple of weeks ago, and he does something similar. He's got a whole JavaScript-based system that he uses to produce things, and he uses OSC messages to kind of drive the visuals. And what he says is that unlike systems that are listening to the music and then reacting, because these are using basically the same messages at the same time that the music making occurs, it doesn't feel like it has any lag, and it feels like it's really tightly connected to the music that you're making. Oh yeah, totally.
You can probably induce a seizure from the stuff, how quick it is,
And then then you have to fall back to ambient music just to bring your audience back, right?
Yeah.
Well, Nick, I am afraid our time is already up. I can't believe it. But before we go, why don't I have you fill people in on where they can go to learn more about both your music and these MIDI controllers and instruments that you're building?
Okay, I think a good place is my website, which is smomid.com, smomid.com. And there's also a Smomid Facebook page and a Smomid Instagram.
All right. And if people you're based out of the East Coast, when you're playing live, do you go under the name Smomid, or how would people know that you're doing a gig in their town?
Yeah, I guess if you follow one of my social media sites, I usually post on that. But you can also send me an email. And also, if anyone I'm kind of like taking orders. If anyone wants to buy an instrument, send me an email, and I'll just put you on the list. But I'm kind of, taking orders from people, because when I actually sell this thing, hopefully it'll be somebody who wants to buy it.
Right on. Well, with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I'll let you head out. Thanks, man, and good luck with continuing to build this stuff. It's really amazing.
Thank you very much.
All right. Many thanks to Nick for having the great chat. Really interesting to hear about the Smomid and the Pyramidis and stuff like that. For those of you who are on Patreon level 2 or tier 2 or above, jump over to patreon.com to /DarwinGross, and you'll see we actually have a video that Nick gave us of him working with the latest rev of the Pyramidi, kind of do a little live piece. It's pretty cool. I want to thank you, the listeners, for all of your help. I want to thank the patrons for helping with financial support of the program, but I want to thank everybody for their support of the program, for sharing it with others, for talking it up on social media, for passing it around. It's what keeps this thing going. I thank you so much. With that, I'm going to let you go. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, drop me a line, ddg@cycling74 or darwin.gross@gmail.com. With that, I'll let you go. Catch you next week around. Bye.